Thank you all for coming to my talk. My name is Mike Klepper, first-time attendee, first-time speaker, and I'm really happy to be here talking about the modern threat landscape. Now, that can mean a whole lot of things to a whole lot of different people, but for our purposes here today, we're going to limit this to four main areas. We're going to take a look at threat actor methods and motivations. We're going to take a look at some of the risks and rewards available to us by incorporating the darknet into our cybersecurity programs. We're then also going to take a look at deepfakes and how those are set to really complicate our lives. And lastly, take a look at some AI-enabled threats, because no talk is allowed to proceed without a mention of AI in this day and age. Then we'll recap for some final thoughts, and if there's any time left, we'll take some questions. Not that I promise to have any answers. So jumping in with threat actor methods and motivations. So there's a lot that's been written over the years about the kinds and types of threat actors that we encounter, whether that is, script kiddies or APT groups or cyber criminals or hacktivists, which can, in the extreme end, border on cyber terrorism, malicious or inept insiders, or even getting into state-sponsored actors doing espionage or cyber warfare operations. But I would like to suggest that all of these groups are unified by a similar idea, and that is value creation. These are all rational actors, right? They're all trying to create value for themselves as they define it for what they're doing, whether that's monetary, social, or political. And understanding what the value is that the attacker is trying to create is going to help us get a better and more complete picture of really what our threat landscape is. So for example, in the 2024 CrowdStrike Global Threat Report, in October of last year, there was a Yemeni threat actor group known as Team R70, and they claimed to do a DDoS attack against a US-based airport because they believed that that airport got more air traffic from Israel than anywhere else. Did those cybersecurity professionals at the airport take that into account in their threat model? Maybe. Maybe not. Willie Sutton was one of the most notorious bank robbers of the 20th century. He's widely credited with Sutton's Law, which is to respond to the most obvious questions with the most obvious answers. When asked, why do you rob banks? He supposedly answered with, because that's where the money is. It's actually false. That was a writer that made that up. In his memoir that he released upon his last get out of jail time, he actually clarified that he robbed banks because he loved it. It was the thrill of it is why he robbed banks, and the money was just the way he kept score. Now, if people understood that at the time, that kind of changes your response to that particular risk, right? Not all banks are created equal if they're going after the most money, but if it's not about the money, maybe my bank is more vulnerable or more likely to be targeted than I would have thought. And while you may make a fair amount of money robbing banks, which I do not recommend, I would submit that one of the fastest ways to get rich is to sell a get-rich-quick scheme. And that's really where cybercrime as a service platforms come into play. If you think about it, they're making a pretty strong offer to the market. For a couple $100 a month, a couple grand a year, you too can go into business with a carding operation. You too can be a purveyor of ransomware. No technical capabilities required. And this is interesting because they're promising strong returns, and for people that are already of criminal inclination, this allows them to pivot into adjacent markets and adjacent threat spaces, right? Why do I have to take the risk of holding somebody up in the street when I can hold up more people across a larger geographic area digitally and have almost no risk of consequences? And that's a very strong motivator. The best data I could find on this was actually from the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report out of 2020, which estimated that only 0.05% of cybercrime is prosecuted. Think about that. Even if in the subsequent years that number is off by a factor of 100, the risk balance still very strongly favors the threat actor, right? So when we talk about motivations, it's pretty good, right? And of course, we have other types of things other than monetary motivations. There was a report done by Accenture last year that showed that After the incursion of Russia into the Ukraine, Western nations started seeing a vast rise in attacks against critical infrastructure, financial institutions, and the like, particularly against those who supported the Ukraine. And these were often attributed to Russian-aligned threat actors that had that hacktivist kind of geopolitical motivation. And this hasn't gotten any better as more areas of the world have descended into violence, right? And this works both from a low-cost attacker kind of perspective, right? Because it doesn't take much for me to launch a cyber operation against a country that's against mine in this particular kind of geopolitical conflict. But we've also seen ransomware notes which have cited the need for fundraising for displaced communities as a result of geopolitical tensions in various ransomware campaigns. Now, whether or not that is a legitimate overture or whether or not that is a pretext trying to make you feel better about being robbed is anybody's guess. However, it is something that is out there. And then we talk about the expanding risk surface. So, rapid adoption of new technologies, AI, cloud, a little older, IoT devices, which are proliferating at very, very quick pace. All of these things are new and interesting things for attackers to go after. They all kind of follow the same sort of risk curve where we're implementing technologies typically in advance of having well thought out security controls for them, because the business always advances with security lagging behind. It's a wave kind of a thing, and those waves are not, they kind of follow one another. And so we take all this together, there's a target-rich environment, there's money to be made, there's very little risk to be had in terms of threat actors from a motivation perspective. But they definitely do want to stay, out of prison. So when we take a look at the methods that they're using right now, there is a lot of methods that they're starting to pivot to. Obviously, they're not really ever moving away from anything that's worked before. But because of advances in EDR technology and detective controls that we've all, very studiously implemented in our organizations, they're really shifting to credential and identity abuse types of scenarios, right? Can I get IDs? Can I get secrets? Can I get, tokens, cookies, things like that? And this does two things for them. First, it makes it very hard to detect because they're using a legitimate credential, accessing whatever permissions and devices that they have, and then they're pivoting and moving laterally from there. It also cuts down their time to monetization. If the most of their time is spent trying to get an initial foothold into an environment, abusing credentials and identity, whether that's through a phishing attack or a breach of a database or other types of scenarios where they come by that data, that saves them time. That allows them to attack more targets and be more likely to get a payoff or a larger volume of payoff. And also configuration abuse. Again, new technologies being implemented without fully understanding the configuration options available and the ramifications of some of those settings is very much also in target, as is, not up here on the slide, they're targeting more frequently perimeter devices that aren't able to have an EDR installed on them. So gateway devices and other appliances, they're targeting pretty heavily right now because it's less likely to trigger any kind of endpoint security solution. And so we all know it's not a question of if, but when. And that's never felt more right than right now, right? I have yet to read a risk report from any vendor anywhere that says, phishing attacks went down like 50% last year. No, that doesn't happen. Everything's always going up and to the right in every one of those reports that at least I've personally read. And even if we had secured our environment, we waved a magic wand and we secured our environment from every historical risk we had, all those vulnerability backlogs, gone. If we were able to do that, tomorrow the threat equation changes. New vulnerabilities come out, new technologies are implemented, new 0 days are identified or end days are identified. It's constantly shifting. And that can be maddening, especially if you're trying to explain to non-technical people in the executive suite why it is they spent all this money, but my risk posture didn't really go down over this period of time. It just kind of stayed flat or kept going up. And it's like, well, the problem space kept changing. And that's something that can be difficult to communicate. But beyond that, I think that attackers themselves don't necessarily need to win in terms of a ransomware payout or something along those lines in order for them to generate value. Because every headline that comes out, every marketing department that says, oh my God, they're out there, they're coming to get you, it creates fear. It attributes to them a certain kind of, currency that is valuable within their community, but also broadly in the social consciousness. So we have turned, through our own efforts in some cases, the attackers into a kind of modern day boogeyman for corporate America. And this fear drives consumption. Every economist will tell you that. And so that becomes problematic when we look at budgets, allocations, and then suddenly it's like, well, there's risk, and as an executive, I need to invest money to reduce that risk appropriately. Maybe that means I don't have so much headcount. Maybe that means I'm not doing what I need to do in the market because I'm focused on this. So ultimately, if we're able to look at this threat landscape and the motivations of the attackers and really dive into the value proposition that the attackers are trying to achieve beyond just the TTPs that they're using, that can help us alter that equation and help us, change our own risk posture. So jumping into the dark web, let's take a look at what the dark web is and isn't, right? First of all, it's not all bad. There are a lot of communities and legitimate organizations that maintain presence on the dark web. For instance, Amnesty International, Bloomberg, CNN, BBC. And these are legitimate, maintained websites on the dark web that you can go to. There's nothing malicious about them. And the dark web is not difficult to access. For those of you who haven't been out there and played around with this, it's pretty simple. Download a Tor browser, a VPN, take some other precautionary steps. And if you don't know how to do that, YouTube's got you covered. There are dozens of videos out there that will tell you in gory detail how to get onto the dark web in 2024. They are not all created equal, and I would recommend watching several of them and combining all of their recommendations before trying this. Now let's talk about what the dark web is. It is a high-risk environment, right? For those of you who know gaming, this is the player versus player area of the map, okay? You are very likely to be attacked just simply by going out there if you aren't taking the right kinds of precautions. It's also not really indexed. There are some limited search capabilities and some pages that list other types of pages. But for the most part, you kind of need to know where you're going in order to get there. And that's part of the appeal, because this makes it very difficult for people to find things and therefore censor things. And the dark web is a great way for oppressed communities to communicate and find information that would otherwise be censored by authoritarian governments, for example, and could get them into trouble if they were being monitored for that. And of course, all of these traits are the same features that make this a great marketplace for criminals who are trying to avoid attention of law enforcement. But ultimately, the people and communities here that are drawn, whether they're criminal or not, are really highly invested in avoiding observation. And the dark web is not all created equal. It's not like one thing. Some of it's actually on the clear web, talking about like pastebin sites and stuff where like old data that's been circulating around the dark web gets dumped. You don't even need to get a Tor browser to get access to some of that stuff. But as you go down closer and closer to the core and find higher and higher value data that's more higher risk to your environment, oftentimes you're going to encounter more and more like professional criminal organizations. And these are oftentimes not even going to be on the web per se. They're going to start to pivot into encrypted messaging apps like Telegram and the like, where they can have a couple 100,000 individuals as part of a Telegram channel, all trading wares and stuff in order to, again, avoid detection and make it harder for law enforcement to come after them. And there are lots of dark web marketplaces out there. And these markets move and they change all the time. To, again, avoid law enforcement and frustrate opportunities or attempts to take them down. But law enforcement does actively work to take down these sites that are trafficking in malicious and illicit goods. In March of 2023, authorities across the US and Europe actually seized the monopoly market shown here, which was a part of an operation for international drug trafficking. And the crackdown was the largest operation of its kind at the time and arrested 300 people, confiscated $53 million, about 120 guns, and 850 kilos of narcotics, some of which had been tracked to overdose deaths in the United States and elsewhere. They do get these things taken down and they work hard to do it, but it is a very time-consuming and usually international process. But most of our organizations really aren't going to be affected by guns and drugs, unless you work somewhere way more interesting than I do. But what we can get impacted by is stolen credentials. And this is something that's trafficked pretty heavily on the dark web, whether that's passwords, secrets, tokens, what have you. And ultimately, when those get grabbed, whether that's through a phishing attack or database compromise or whatever, within a couple of days, they start to get monetized, right? They hit an initial access broker. They might just sell those on to somebody else who wants to run ransomware or drop a coin mining operation someplace. They might use them themselves. And these credentials can be purchased for anywhere from a few dollars a piece to maybe a few $1,000s a piece, depending upon the organization and the level of privileges that they have within those organizations, how fresh they are, and the like. But everybody has friends. And what do you like to do with your friends? Share stuff. You like to give them things, be a good guy. And so over the course of about 18 months, these credentials get sold and resold and shared and kicked over to your buddy, kind of a thing. And sooner or later, the value over time of those credentials go down, because they're more likely to have been detected to be used in an offensive operation. They're more likely to have been subject to a password reset. Maybe the accounts are no longer there because the person quit and changed jobs or whatever. So they decrease in value as a number of attackers that have access to them increases. Because as the value declines, that data percolates up to those surface level dark web forums where every hacker wannabe can get them. And that's where you see password stuffing attack data sets start to come from, right? Because users, individuals, some of us in this room, may not have always made the best choices when it came to passwords, right? Maybe they weren't as complex as we would have liked. Maybe we thought it was pretty good. We used it across multiple accounts. And all these things contribute to passwords getting reused. And data suggests, looking at the volume of passwords that have been recovered from the dark web, that users do this about 2/3 of the time across multiple services. And that means that the attackers know once they get one user ID and password, they're going to go try that everywhere they can think of. And they are pretty likely, statistically speaking, to find that that opens another door for them and gives them more bang for the buck. And ultimately, as this goes on to day N, this doesn't change. So I want to talk about a scenario here. Let's think about your team, your organization. You got an employee that's doing a great job. He sits down in his lunch hour to book a family vacation. And he wants to get the confirmation letter for that vacation at his desk. So he goes to his favorite travel website and uses his work email for that. Goes through, books his vacation, and it says, hey, give me a password to protect your profile. And maybe he uses one that's top of mind, like the one he logged in with that morning. And he pops it in there and goes, great, gets his email and looks forward to going to Disney World. Well, in a month from now, when that travel website gets hacked and user data is taken, the threat actors end up with a username associated with your domain and a password associated with that username. They're going to go try to use it to get into your organization. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. You can see that happen over and over and over again when you start looking at dark web data. Let's take another example. Let's say that you have a new hire, and that new hire is all excited. They got their badge, they got their laptop, boom, they set their password on their new account. How do you know it's not the password they were using last week at their old employer? They got phished from them a month before that. You don't. So over time, it's not just about, oh, I lost a credential, that's bad. It's this credential got lost at some point in the past and everyone forgot, and now this person's reusing it again. And that's even worse because the threat actors know this happens, they mine that data, and they keep replaying it over and over and over again, looking to see if they get lucky because it's a low-cost operation for them. So how can we use this data to our own benefit? Well, first of all, monitor this stuff, right? Get out there, make sure that those passwords that have been disclosed, those tokens that have been disclosed, all of that isn't actually something that's a risk for your environment. This actually aligns with the current NIST best practices for password standards, right? It's no longer about rotation every 90 days, it's about password integrity. And that's really where you can bring this into use. If anyone offshores anything, the dark web data is a great place to determine whether or not the people you're offshoring things to are working in your best interest. Multiple times I have seen organizations who have offshored work, and I'm sure that they went through their due diligence and their offshore partner said, oh, yep, we're doing all the security best practices, yet passwords for that organization are being lost off Windows 10 single language edition laptops with no EDR protection that are infected with malware, while a user is not only administrating their ServiceNow environment, but 3 others. Had a really interesting one once where I found a guy who had been doing some development work on a mobile application for a particular organization and had been infected at the time, lost the creds to the Git environment as well as the UAT environment in AWS for the mobile app. And I brought this to their attention and they said, we've never hired anybody offshore to do mobile development for us. And I said, well, who did you hire? Because I can tell you who they outsourced that work to. It was this guy. Dark web data is invaluable for understanding how that business is breaking out. And ultimately, this also will allow us to determine what our remediation needs are after a malware infection. Because if you've got malware that's password stealing or keylogging on a device, it's not enough to just go reset their password in Azure or whatever. What else did that malware have access to? Did it get creds to AWS? Did it steal session tokens from Okta? Did it get other passwords to platforms as a service? It's not one password you need to reset. It is sessions that you need to kill off. It is several different types of locations you've got to go to change passwords to make sure that threat actors don't still have a path into your environment or to your data, which more and more is held in other SaaS platforms and providers outside of your organization. All right, jumping into deepfakes. So we live in a time in which we can't trust our ears. And voice cloning is very easy to accomplish, and it's very, very difficult for people to detect through hearing alone, right? And this is also much easier to distribute than video content in terms of getting past filters and identification and things like that, right? So this becomes, I would suggest, a bigger risk here in the short term for us than deepfake video. Deepfake video oftentimes has a lot of problems. There's artifacts, there's strange stuff. People understand visual things far more readily. We're able to detect anomalies than through hearing alone. And audio data is just stupid easy to get. 53% of adults put their voice online once a week. What's more concerning is that 49% of adults do it 5 to 10 times a week. Whether that's voicemail, YouTube, hey, I'm being recorded right now. So, you know, I'm done for. But I don't know why anyone would want to clone my voice. But certainly, this is something that becomes significantly more pervasive. It's also less computationally intensive than doing the audio version of this. And what's interesting is that while professional quality voice clones typically take a minimum of 20 to 30 minutes of high-grade audio to create, and like any other generative model, the more data you feed it, the higher the quality of that data, the better it's going to be. So they're usually recommending 60 to 90 minutes. There are services out there that will claim to do a passable voice clone on under a minute of data, of voice data. And this has opened up some interesting monetization techniques for threat actors, such as virtual kidnapping. And this is kind of a play on a kind of an older extortion model where they would call up and say, hey, grandma, I'm down here in Jamaica and I'm in prison. Quick, send me money. And people fell for that, right? They target the elderly who have hearing loss anyway, so they don't hear so good. They might not be able to be in contact with those loved ones really easily, and they fall victim to this. I've actually had members of my own family fall victim to this. Nowadays, what they're doing is they're going to social media because anyone under the age of about, 25, has put every living moment of their life on the internet. And they're grabbing audio and they're creating virtual clones of these kids who are now screaming in the background. And they're telling their parents, we're going to clip your kid if you don't pay us money. It gets dark real fast. And what we also see is this technology being just as easily to be used in political campaigns, right? It's an election year. It's kind of, we knew it was coming, but this was actually the first year in which a documented case of fake voice, synthetic voice, was used in a political campaign. Earlier this year in New Hampshire, there was a robocall claiming to be the voice of Joe Biden, encouraging people not to go out and vote in the primary. And this was the brainchild of a guy called Steve Kramer, who was a political consultant for a Democratic candidate, an opposing Democratic candidate. And he claimed he did this as a stunt to draw attention to the dangers of AI technology and generative technologies in our politics, but that doesn't quite ring true to me, given that he didn't really come forward with that until his partner in crime was like, hey, yeah, we did this. That guy paid me $150. For his efforts, he is now facing about $6 million in fines from the FCC and about 26 criminal counts under various New Hampshire state laws. So again, don't recommend it. Beyond that, if you're in a service provider kind of area, the telecom that distributed these calls got hit with $1 million fine from the FCC also. So depending upon the nature of your organization, distributing such content could hold some potential liability or fines for you, depending upon what that looks like. And lastly, voice verification and authentication systems are uniquely at risk for this kind of technology. And these systems are pretty prevalent. I was actually surprised. I started looking into this. They're pretty popular in the financial sector, medical sector. They can be used for password resets and things like that. And study from the University of Waterloo showed that even the market-leading solutions could be bypassed in 6 attempts with synthetic voice. Now, to be fair, those vendors have pushed back on those findings and said, hey, it was in a lab, so on and so forth. Actual documented instances of this happening are few and far between. They do exist, but then it took about 12 attempts to get past. So 6, was a little too much. We can't trust our eyes either. Now, this is interesting because there was a private industry notification from 2021 that the FBI suggested that synthetic content could be used for what they were terming business identity compromise at the time. And this was, the act of creating synthetic personas based on existing employees and using those for financial and reputational damage to organizations. And we have seen this happen. Deepfake and face swapping technology has actually come a long way. It's pretty easy. I'm sure most of the people in this room heard about the $25.6 million that a poor guy in Hong Kong transmitted as a result of a deepfaked Zoom call, which I suspect was just face swapping done through the Zoom plugin. That wasn't the only case, though. It was the only one that was really kind of super popularized, but there was another case in Mongolia where a scammer face swapped to impersonate an individual who called a friend of his and said, hey, I'm trying to get this transaction of some sort done. I need a loan. Can you float me the money? And his buddy said, sure, and transferred 805,000 US dollars so that this person could complete this transaction. I don't know what they were buying, but in my book, that's one hell of a friend. Pornographic content, I mean, human beings, what can you say? There's been a lot of synthetic adult content or synthetic sexually explicit material generated as a result of this. Earlier this year, this kind of took popular attention when Taylor Swift got used, her images were used in explicit material and distributed on the internet, and those were viewed tens of millions of times before they were able to be taken down. Now, this is troubling because most of us don't have the resources of a billion-dollar pop star. So let's think of the scenario where this can be used against individuals within your organization for sextortion or other monetization schemes or access schemes. They call up and they say, hey, guess what? I've got sexually explicit content about you, and I'm going to give that to your spouse, your religious leaders, your employer, and your kids, unless you do this for me, right? I'm willing to bet we don't have an incident response plan for that. And this is sadly something that can drive people to self-harm. So this does kind of border on an employee safety issue as well. And even kind of beyond that, if we think about cases where, even if we're not looking at external kind of forces, let's say you have an HR complaint against a particular employee and that someone's using synthetic content to justify that complaint to HR. If later it's determined that that employee was wrongfully terminated as a result of fake content, that could cause liability for the organization. So we need to have tools to be able to validate that content. We need to be able to look at that content, and we need to incorporate this into our incident response playbooks. And then at a societal level, we need to understand, really from a media sophistication and kind of media education perspective, how these types of technologies can be used against us by our enemies geopolitically to undermine public confidence in social institutions, leaders, individuals, and ultimately drive a populace toward civil unrest, which can result in lots of unpleasant things. So how do we do something about this? Well, first of all, having policies and having a plan, right? That's where everything starts, kind of with all security, really. But beyond that, training our users and implementing technology that's going to help them, because users aren't going to be 100% correct 100% of the time. Human beings fail. It's 5 o'clock on a Friday, we're sick, we're tired, we're overworked. We click something out of expediency, and next thing you know, things aren't great. Next, we need to also look at digital watermarking solutions for our media and limit the kinds of media that we're putting out there that could be abused and reused, and also architecting processes that will insert delay into these types of things, so that when someone calls you up with a video call pretending to be your CFO and says, send $20 million someplace, there's a process that injects a sanity check in there and a cool-off period. And most importantly, if you do that, you need to encourage and award people that stand up to that. Because the minute you punish somebody for standing up to power, that's the last moment in which that security program will be effective. because nobody else is going to stand up and take that risk if they know they're just going to get beat down for it. All right, AI-enabled threats. Bet no one's heard that lately. So I like to think of this as kind of a two sides of a coin, right? What threats are arising from the rise of AI from outside of our organization versus those for our adoption of AI within our organization. And so what we're seeing right now, according to all the resources I've been able to read, is that threat actors are using AI in much the same way we are, right? Threat actors are a business. They're looking to accelerate their path to monetization and spend less time doing stuff, just like we are. It's nice we have something in common. So they're actually using this to more effectively profile people, do some scripting stuff, and really accelerate their work streams, just like we are. Now, of course, one of the outcomes of this is they're able to do things a lot faster, and that's kind of supported by the 50+% rise in phishing volumes that we saw in this past year, according to some threat reports. But more importantly, they're going to be able to train particular models on targets and make really clickbait, compelling spear phishing and whaling attacks for individuals, right? And that's going to really kind of make that particular like high value asset target quite a bit more challenging. They're also looking to, disrupt particularly Western related elections quite a bit through influence campaigns. And they're combining that with the playbooks around influence operations and, disinformation campaigns that, the Internet Research Agency out of Russia, if I remember that correctly, was already using the 2016 campaign when they got censured for their, attempts to meddle in that. We're also going to see them develop malware variants more rapidly. Now, for the most part, they're not going to have AI writing code for them because anyone who's tried to have AI write code for you knows it doesn't really necessarily work all that well all the time. But it is going to make them rapidly co-develop things quite a bit quicker. And they also, again, open up some new monetization attacks which are going to intersect with us kind of both on a corporate level and possibly personally. So from a monetization perspective, one of the kind of things that they've started doing is if they can get access to your credentials for those AI models that you're using, they're actually using these as the back end to populate and power virtual brothels. So anyone who wants to subscribe to an AI chatbot that thinks you're really handsome or lovely, that's kind of what's going on the back end. They're also using localized models for that, but there's also a lot of passing that cost on to your organizations. And that bill can be very, very high. In addition to that, they're also using these technologies to drive real estate theft, which is interesting. They are looking at, they're basically finding properties that are abandoned and using various AI-enabled technologies to pass themselves off as the legitimate owner, take loans out against those properties and or sell those properties, and then leave the actual owner of that property to figure out what's going on with the person who they stole the money from. So lots of risks there. From an internal perspective, a lot of these things have been talked about. Biased decisions is one that's going to get us, and one that's going to be really hard to ferret out, right? Because a lot of bias is unconscious. And if you unconsciously train AI models with bias, you're not really in the best position to find that bias. And this is going to be interesting because, biased decisions, it's, in there as one of the risks of, these types of models. But how do you test for that? How do you go to your auditor and say, yeah, hey, we tested for bias? It's not just a matter of running queries. I mean, that's statistical analysis. And that's not something that we traditionally have done as pen testers or vulnerability management people or what have you. So there's some interesting questions I have there for myself. making sure that workforce-related impacts are going to be an interesting one. So there's lots of data out there that shows AI makes junior analysts more proficient, that it gives them a productivity bump, and that's great. But what happens if that AI tool becomes unavailable? We have to be able to use that tool to train people and make sure that that tool is training them on actual corrected data and not a hallucination or not bad data. Because then you have somebody that is going to really double down on the fact that they were taught by AI this thing which is wrong. And that's going to lead to suboptimal outcomes. Also, while people will say you're not going to lose your job to AI, I'm on the fence about that, right? If you look at certain segments of our population, check your marketing team. How many people were in your marketing team 3 years ago? How many people are in your marketing team now? Probably less because of generative AI. And anytime you start to displace workers with any kind of technology, that gives rise to potential hacktivism or malicious insider risks, and that can, again, come out to haunt you. And flaws in AI-initiated responses. Just like intrusion prevention systems back in the day, when everyone went, hey, we got IPS, and you're like, oh, is it preventing anything? They're like, no, we didn't turn that on. Everyone's going to incorporate AI features to make decisions in their products or security products. But is that decision that the AI makes going to be able to be abused by a threat actor, right? And we have historical evidence that these types of things happen with features over time, and it's likely that we're going to find some of those as we adopt these solutions. So, obviously this is an evolving situation, it's evolving rapidly. We need to have open communication with our business leaders because we can't make the mistake we did with the cloud, where we said, don't go to the cloud, nobody use the cloud. And then we said, who's using the cloud? And they all went. So we need to engage with them early, and even if we just document that they're using AI in certain ways, that's going to put us ahead of the game. We need to have some policies there, require transparencies, and this is really going to complicate our third-party risk management programs. Because our third-party risk management program needs to take into account whether or not the AI our third parties are using is actually doing what it's supposed to do. We have transparency around the test data, and we understand the conclusions that it is going to be making. Furthermore, we're going to need to have our own test cases so that we can continue to validate that over time. So, in summation, focus on mission assurance and risk management, because ultimately that doesn't change. Whatever technology comes along, that stays the same. We need to monitor control effectiveness and risks as threats evolve and make sure that we have controls at all the inflection points that we can. I would suggest that we all take comfort in the fact that machine learning and artificial intelligence is going to help us on balance more than it will hurt us. My opinion, but I think it'll bear out. We need to educate employees and back that up with tooling, because no people are going to be right all the time. And ultimately, in the course of my career, I've seen several different evolutions of technology, right? I mean, when I started doing this, most people didn't have a personal computer, right? Broadband wasn't even a thing. This is just the latest disruptive technical evolution that we've seen, right? We've adapted to those that came before, and we'll rise to the challenge again. But as J.M. Barrie wrote, all of this has happened before, and it will all happen again. And when it does, just remember that you got this. Thank you.